Is religion useful? Why do people believe in religion? Now, the most common, sometimes automatic answer is, well, because it's true. So we spend a lot of time arguing about whether religion in general is in fact true and disbelievers are wrong, or if one particular religion is true while all of the others are false. And we're typically unsatisfied socially with how these arguments go. Both the religious and the non-religious get frustrated with the goes nowhere nature of these discussions. So I want to transition then to two hard questions, one for the religious and one for the not religious. All right, for the religious, let's start with a completely immoral experiment. Now, this is only a thought experiment. Don't try this at home or in real life. But suppose, for the sake of this immoral thought experiment, that you went to an orphanage where there's a bunch of babies, or you went to a maternity ward in some large city, and you take a bunch of those babies. I don't know, say you take 100 of them, or you take 1,000 of them, however many, and then you ship them around the world. But what you do is you place, say, all of those babies with strictly Muslim families in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Or you had taken those same babies and placed them with strictly Baptist parents in Tennessee. Or you had taken those babies and placed them with strictly Hindu families in New Delhi, India, and so forth. So you've placed them, and then you're following up 25 years later, and now all of those babies have grown to adulthood. Question: what religion are the now adults? And it seems safe to say that about 99% or more would be the religion of their parents and whatever the predominant social environment is that they were raised in. The kids raised Muslim would be Muslim. The kids raised Hindu would be Hindu. The kids raised Protestant Baptist would be Protestant Baptist. Now, the hard implication of this sort of thought experiment for believers is this: do I believe my religion because it's true, or because I happen to have been born into it and was just more or less conditioned to it by my parents and the predominant social environment? Can I say in my heart of hearts that if I'd been born into a different religious culture, that I would not have been conditioned to believe that different religion, but somehow I would have independently come to reason my way to the religion that I now believe to be true? And that's a hard and deeply personal question for each of us to answer for ourselves. Now, here's a hard question for non-believers in religion. You spend a lot of time, if you're actively involved, arguing that religion is not true. You're focusing on critiquing the arguments for religion. You're developing arguments against religion. And then you also focus a lot on the sometimes non-rational or even anti-rational methods that some religious people use to defend their religious beliefs. Now, suppose you're correct and religion is not true. Here's the question: does that matter? Now, the easy answer and the good answer is to say, well, it does matter. Truth matters in things. And truth matters partly and largely because truth is meant to be a guide to action in the world. Truth means believing the way reality actually is, and true beliefs lead to successful action. False beliefs lead to actions that basically cause reality to smack you in the face. So if religion is false, it sets one up for unsuccessful living. So it matters whether religion is true or false. But there's often a very long chain of connections between a false belief and its action implications. Also, philosophies and religions are complexes made up of many, many constituent beliefs, and often they are a mixture of some true beliefs and some false beliefs. There also is the psychological phenomenon we know of the placebo effects of beliefs. False beliefs in some limited contexts can have beneficial effects. So even if religion is false, there's work to be done to show that its falsehood matters, and that is hard to work out. So we need some more nuance as we start to explore this rich territory. And I think the needing nuance makes sense because religions are a type of philosophy. They provide answers to all of the important questions that we thoughtful and passionate beings engage with. What really is truth? What is reality? Who am I? How should I live my life? And then the big divide here philosophically between theist and atheist philosophies. Now, the root here is theos. That's a Greek word for a deity or a god. And so in addressing all of those philosophical questions, theistic philosophies typically stress non-naturalistic or supernaturalistic answers to those important questions. And here I'm taking mainstream Judaism, mainstream Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, Buddhism, and so on as representative. Now, the claims here are that beyond the natural world are gods or a god or deities or a major deity, supernatural beings in varying degrees that exist and that they are the causal explanation for what happens in the natural world. Now, sometimes these gods or God are thought to be known through rational methods in some religions of experience and inference, although of course also through non-rational methods in many religions of mysticism or faith. Religions typically argue that we humans partake in the divine by possessing a soul or a spirit, something that is non-physical, survives bodily death, or that we have some element of divine consciousness that does or can transcend our physical bodies and the natural world. Further, religions typically argue and hold that our standards of good and evil come from God or the gods, and that our values, particularly our most important values, should be formed with and aimed at with reference to God or the gods. Now, that of course is religion in general, and there are lots of variations within religions on all of those themes. But usually religions in particular are what's at stake. And each particular religion is further individualized by each individual believer. So just as there are lots of differences between Christians and Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists and so forth, even within all of those religions, not all believers are monolithically on the same page with everything. And it's the same thing that holds with non-religious philosophies. Often people who are not religious, whatever philosophy they come up with, it's driven by very different considerations. So there are lots of types of religions, and there are lots of individuals within those religions who are driven by different considerations. So I like to think of this kind of funny taxonomy of Christians. To take just one example, I heard it first from one of my uncles years ago, who was a Pentecostal preacher, and he told me, he said, Steve, when I was a kid, there's three types of Christians. There are Christmas Christians, there are Good Friday Christians, and there are Easter Sunday Christians. And there's a significant grain of truth here. So if we elaborate on what this means, if you think about what Christmas means, well, Christmas is about birth. In Christian theology, it's the birth of Jesus, who becomes Jesus Christ, who is part of the Trinity. So he is the most important, and the entire religion is named after him and its birth. And it's about celebrating his birth. And what we do is we get together with family and friends and people we love, and we eat a lot of food, and we take the day off, and we give each other presents. So it's all about life and living and birth and celebration and benevolence and love. And that's the heart and soul of Christmas Christianity. Now, Good Friday, though Christianity, is a very different psychological world. Good Friday is, again, according to Christian history, the day that Jesus Christ was crucified. So it is the day on which this man, or who is also God in the Christian tradition, suffered enormous pains. He felt that he had been betrayed, that he was being persecuted. He was physically being tormented and socially scorned and treated. And he then ultimately is, through this horrible method of execution, killed, and he dies only after a significant amount of suffering, bloodshed, and so forth. So if this is the significant part of Christianity for you, if this is where psychologically you most resonate with what Christianity is all about, well, it's about suffering and torment and martyrdom. But then there's also, my uncle said, the Easter Sunday Christians, for whom this is the most important day in the Christian calendar. And this is the third day after the crucifixion, where Jesus, who had been put in a cave and a big rock sealing it up, I'm doing the cartoon version of this story now, the rock is rolled back, the tomb is found to be empty, and Jesus has been resurrected on this interpretation, and he has ascended to heaven. And this is the most important lesson in Christianity, the possibility of life after death, that we as Christians hope for immortality of some sort, that we want to survive bodily death, to have a soul that goes on and is reunited with everything that is good and everything that matters in this beautiful and wonderful, majestic place in the beyond. Now, the point of all of this is that Christmas Christianity, Good Friday Christianity, and Easter Sunday Christianity are very different psychologically. One is about benevolence and love. One is about suffering and martyrdom. One is about hope in an afterlife. And at a high level of abstraction, of course, all of these three types of Christians are Christian. You know, if you were, for example, just to make up a formal list of, say, 12 or 15 things, here are the things that Christians believe, and you went to the Christmas Christians and said, do you believe these 12 or 15 things? And they would all say, yes, I agree with those things. And the same is what you would hear from the Good Friday Christians and from the Easter Sunday Christians. So they all agree with the abstract list of propositions that go into making up Christianity, but that abstract list is not where the heart of the action is for them. And the point of this then is that it's not always clear beyond this formal agreement that members of different approaches to Christianity really are believing in the same religion. Other things in the list are more distant to them. They may pay lip service to them. That's not to be sarcastic about it, but it's just not operative in their psychology as what their religion is all about. And the point then is going to be, if we're going to be arguing within the religion, or even from outside of the perspective of the religion, to make headway in any sort of discussion about the religion, we have to know what exactly the particular person's religion is, and to meet them in that intellectual and value and psychological context.
You're listening to Open College on the Possibly Correct Network with renowned philosopher and author Dr. Stephen Hicks, a podcast to explain the chaos, taking an in-depth look into how postmodernism is affecting the modern world and your lives without you even realizing it. Stay up to date with the latest releases and news from Dr. Hicks by following the podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Minds.com and Gab, or sign up to our email list at www.opencollegepodcast.com. While you're online, please show your support for the podcast by leaving a review on your chosen media player. Now back to the podcast.
I want to next turn to then a historical framing of this issue, which is to say, if we go back to this question about the truth of religion and ask the question whether a religion's being true or not matters, that question itself has gone through various stages. Of course, for as long as people have been thoughtful and rational about their religion, they will try to provide evidence for the conclusions that they reach, or they will see those conclusions as hypotheses initially that they've reached that explain various sorts of phenomena that they are trying to account for. And so all religions do go through a phase of not just being myths and stories and narratives that we tell, but also having arguments to try to show that in fact the religion is true. And then over the course of the history of religion, some people will look at those arguments and think the arguments work, and some people will look at them and say, no, the arguments don't work. When people then say, well, I guess the arguments don't work, there's a further fork in the road, some people will say, okay, so the arguments don't work, but I'm still going to believe in the religion, and they will turn to faith and mystical and non-rational methods of continuing to believe in their religion, turning away from the argument approach. And then others who will argue, well, if the arguments don't work for proving or showing that a given religion is true, then we should just abandon that religion, find a better religion, or not be religious at all. So then what we have is the standard breakdown of core issues in religion, one being the metaphysical issue, is God or the God's existence the best explanation for the way the world is or not? And then the other corresponding issue, the epistemological issue. Should we be addressing these religious issues through reason or through various non-rational reasons? Now, the historical point I want to make is that all of this arguing back and forth about religion reached an intellectual peak in the 1700s. It really was an astonishing era for discussions about religion, both by believers and by disbelievers. And by the time we get to the 1700s, we call the long 1700s the Age of Enlightenment, at least in European, especially in Western and North American intellectual history. This was a very naturalistic, science was developing, people were becoming more literate, and because of the prestige of the Enlightenment and the philosophies that fed into the Enlightenment, religion and the arguments for religion came to the fore. People who were becoming increasingly advocates of reason were starting to say, well, with respect to religion, if we're going to maintain a place for religion, religion has to meet the standards of rationality. And so we have to really look at the arguments and do the best work we can, looking at them pro and con and making our best rational judgment about whether they work. And also, people who were significantly religious had been imbued with the spirit of reason and the Enlightenment and taken up the challenge that, yes, we should be able to show that religion has an honorable place in human intellectual life, that we can show that, in fact, our religion is reasonable or rationality, that the arguments work. So there's an enormous amount of energy invested in delineating the arguments, pro and con, and subjecting them to scrutiny at a very high level. In my judgment, this was the best century ever in human history for the discussion of the arguments for and against religion. But then an astonishing thing happened. By the time we got to the end of the 1700s, maybe the last quarter century or so, maybe a little bit earlier, something astonishing happened. Most major thinkers came to an agreement that the arguments for the truth of religion don't work. And here I want to do a little bit of shorthand potted history and just mention four of the giant names in the history of philosophy and in the history of philosophy of religion. David Hume, Immanuel Kant, Arthur Schopenhauer, and Soren Kierkegaard. But of course, any number of others could be mentioned. I'm going to mention those four because in all of the histories of religion, all of the histories of philosophy, these are giant names who stand head and shoulders above lots of other pretty significant names as well. And what's also interesting is that two of those thinkers, Hume and Schopenhauer, are atheists, and two of them, Kant and Kierkegaard, are defenders of religion. So we've got major brains and a split in terms of the conclusions, two atheists and two theists of various sorts. And what we find is then this unusual thing that all of them are reaching the same conclusion. The arguments, the traditional arguments that we can lay out, don't prove the existence of God, don't prove that any particular religion is true. They're all subject to fatal weaknesses. And in fact, the arguments, if we go by the standard of reason and rationality against religion, are quite compelling. So they, of course, all go in different directions here, but what I'm focusing on is this claim that's reached that the arguments do not work. We can't then prove by rationality, by evidence, by logic that God exists. So Hume, of course, wants to argue the arguments don't work. The dialogues concerning natural religion, they were published posthumously in the 1770s. So the arguments for the existence of God don't work, and what we should, therefore we should disbelieve in the existence of God, become non-theistic, and go by our natural feelings fundamentally. Immanuel Kant also agrees, now publishing his major work starting in the 1780s. The arguments don't work. We cannot, in principle, prove the existence of God. But we should still be religious and believe on faith in these kind of imaginable regulative principles, God that endowed us with a free will, and so we also have an immortal soul, that we have a kind of religion that can be salvaged even though the arguments for the existence of God do not work. In the next generation, early 1800s, now Arthur Schopenhauer, the arguments don't work. And so since these arguments don't work, ultimately Schopenhauer then wants to say this idea that we have some sort of benevolent being or scientific kind of God who organized the world according to cause and effect. All of that is just subjective projection. And Schopenhauer sees the implications of all of this as being somewhat nihilistic, and then urges us ultimately to embrace some sort of nihilism. Shortly thereafter, Soren Kierkegaard, now a religious guy, also though agrees that the arguments don't work, but then he goes on the offensive and says that just shows that if we're going to find any sort of meaning or significance in our life, we have to be explicitly irrational, embrace contradiction, embrace the absurd, reject reason, and make a passionate commitment to a kind of irrational faith. So we've got four big names going off in different directions, but what's striking is that all four of them agree on one fundamental point. And I don't know that there's ever another era in the history of philosophy when so many of the giant names agree on something so significant. Now, this, though, has important implications for the history of religion and the next stages in the philosophy of religion and in religious practice. If we now have intellectuals, and many, of course, informed, thoughtful people who read and, of course, think for themselves about these issues, if it's the case that religion cannot be shown to be true, then it follows that either we're going to follow reason, right, and discard religion, or we're going to have to accept religion on some sort of faith and find some way to undermine or set aside reason. And this then is the big fork in the road epistemologically that takes us into the modern debate over reason and faith. Now, on all of this so far, this historical section here, don't take my word for it. I'm now just functioning as a journalist or historian of philosophy, reporting what the major philosophers and the major theologians and the major philosophers of religion have concluded in this decisive era spanning late 1700s on into the early 1800s. And then a further implication then is, it's another decisive shift in the history of religion, is that thinkers about religion start to focus on a different question, not primarily the question about whether religion is true or not. We're going to set that one aside. The question is, if religion is not true, what explains its staying power? And this then coincides with a pragmatic turn. Now, there is a significant pragmatic turn in philosophy in general, starting in the middle part of the 1800s, but particularly in discussions of religion, we find an upsurge of a kind of pragmatism applied to religion. So, pragmatism in general wants us to say, don't ask whether a theory is true or not. That's now an old-fashioned question. Ask rather what a theory consequences are. What are the results of that theory? Set aside the issue of truth and focuses on the practical results of it. The pragma, right? What works, what happens in deed. So religion then, in this generically pragmatic account, then opens up some interesting territory for us to explore, because everyone wants to recognize that if it turns out that religion is not true, maybe people have been believing in false things. It's nonetheless true that lots and lots of people believe in religion, and their belief in religion has consequences for themselves individually and then more broadly in society. Now, here what I want to do is then flag four more thinkers. And again, I'm going to take some who are more religion friendly, and two of them rather, who are more religion friendly, and two of them who are more antagonistic toward religion. And what they have in common is that they're all thinkers after the Enlightenment turn, and the realization that the arguments for religion don't work, and that they're all taking up and making central to their analysis of religion the issue of not truth, but practical functionality or some sort of pragmatic analysis of religion. Now, the four I'm going to mention here, again, just a short potted history of each of them, are Tocqueville, Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud. And Tocqueville writing in the 1830s, Marx coming online in the 1840s and on through the 50s and 60s, Nietzsche writing 1870s, 80s, and so forth, Freud coming online 1900 on into 1910s and 1920s. And the question here is, what purposes does religion serve independently of the question of whether it is true or not? And what we're going to what I want to do is first pair Tocqueville and Marx, who want to argue that religion is primarily to be identified with its social functions, its social usefulness, or its political practicality. And by contrast, Nietzsche and Freud are going to emphasize the more individual, first, psychological purposes of religion, with social purposes being secondary as well. So, Tocqueville, for example, notice the flavor of this analysis when he writes about religion. This is in the context 1830s of his travels through early America, and he's trying to capture what this phenomenon of democracy as being experimented upon and realized in the most famous modern experiment in democracy, early America. And what Tocqueville essentially argues is that religion is important for Americans. Now, Tocqueville's not a particularly religious guy. My reading of him, if you push on him, he may be a kind of deist, but that's not something he's interested really in arguing for and getting into knockdown discussions about whether religion is true or not. Instead, what he wants to focus on is the role of religion in a democratic society such as America. It's a new country that is being built. Everybody is busy. Everybody is practically oriented in their concerns with making a living, getting rich, expanding the country, raising their families. Democracy is a participatory process, so they're involved in their village life or their town life and the politics as well. And Tocqueville then wants to say, look, whether religion or not not is true is a very hard question. All of these theological matters that the big brains in history have been debating and analyzing, they're really beyond the education level of most Americans. And not only that, they are issues that are extraordinarily complicated even for intelligent people who have a lot of time on their hands to wrap their minds around and come with an informed viewpoint on. So this is then not something that we can ask Americans to do. They don't have the time, they don't have the education in order to do it well. And if we ask them to do that, then they're just going to do basically a bad job of it. But nonetheless, Americans, like everybody else, have certain social needs. They need to have a value framework. They need to have a set of beliefs about what's right and wrong. And those beliefs need to be widely shared in a society so that people know more or less what they can expect from each other, that they can trust each other, and that they have a common framework for building upon their society upon. So the important thing about religion for Tocqueville is not whether it is true, but whether it can serve the practical function of providing a shared framework and a set of moral values that hardworking, not very well educated people can agree upon so as to make their social living possible. And Tocqueville then endorses religion for that purpose, not because it's true, but because it is a practical usefulness. So, let's contrast then Karl Marx with his famous analysis of religion, drawing on Feuerbach and others of his generation. Now, of course, Marx is much more cynical and skeptical about modern societies, early capitalism, arguing that it's an exploitative system, the rich versus the poor, the politically connected from the disenfranchised, that it's a society based on alienation and exploitation and various forms of oppression. And what Marx then wants to argue is that religion is not true. He is an atheist, but nonetheless, religion is and always has been a practical and successfully practical tool of political control by the elites. That basically, if we take, for example, Christianity in one of its modern incarnations, what Christianity does is provide a kind of consolation prize for the poor and the oppressed. Your life is terrible. You have no wealth. You are poor. You're never going to be rich. You're working hard. And meanwhile, you're seeing all of these rich people out there who are doing well and living their lives very well. And this just oppresses you. Well, what does the Christian religion in particular, Marx wants to argue, do in the context of that society? Well, it tells people in Sunday sermons, the love of money is the root of all evil. And so tells the poor people, well, why are you concerned about being rich in the first place? If you want to save your soul, you shouldn't be interested in riches. It tells the poor people it'll be easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. And basically that's impossible for the camels to go through the eye of a needle, so rich people aren't going to heaven. So don't envy the rich people. They're going to get their punishment in the next life. So the idea, Marx says, is that religion is not true. These stories are not true. There is no heaven. There is no justice in the hereafter. But what the religion is doing is teaching the poor to accept their lot in this world. And so the powers that be have this vested interest in promoting religion and promoting this religion in particular as a tool of social control, as a way of protecting their exalted position in society. So notice what we have then here, if we contrast Tocqueville and Marx, is that both of them are not at all interested in religion's truth. They're both interested in its practical uses. And they just then differ over whether those practical uses are good or bad. Tocqueville arguing that they're salutary, that they're good for society, and Marx arguing that they are bad for society.
Friedrich Nietzsche was famous for his statement that God is dead, and his provocative account of master and slave moralities, and also for the fact that Adolf Hitler and the Nazis claim that Nietzsche was one of their great inspirations. Were the Nazis right to do so, or did they misappropriate Nietzsche's philosophy? Professor Stephen Hicks's concisely written book, Nietzsche and the Nazis, based on the 2006 documentary, corrects many widespread misconceptions about Nietzsche, giving a fascinating and easy-to-understand analysis of Nietzsche's work, asking and answering a number of questions, such as what were the key elements of Hitler and the National Socialist political philosophy? How did the Nazis come to power in a nation as educated and civilized as Germany? What was Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy? The philosophy of live dangerously, and that which does not kill us makes us stronger? And to what extent did Nietzsche's philosophy provide a foundation for the horrors perpetrated by the Nazis? Professor Hicks demonstrates his mastery of this subject using quotes and critical analysis that prove his points and show the true linkage between Nietzsche and the Nazis and how philosophical ideas move the world. Get your copy of Nietzsche and the Nazis by Stephen Hicks on Amazon.com today. And while you're online, please leave a review for the Open College podcast hosted by Hicks himself on iTunes or Stitcher. Now back to the podcast.
Now, I want to next turn to Nietzsche and Freud, and what both of them have in common is a psychological analysis of the function of religion. Neither of them believes that religion is true. They are atheists, but they think that's not a very interesting question to ask about religion anymore. Instead, the question is, what is religion doing for people, first as individuals, and then only secondarily as members of society? And what Nietzsche wants to point out is to say, look, if you look at lots of people who are religious, not all of them are poor and exploited. In fact, lots of people who are poor and have a very hard life are not particularly religious at all. And then if you look at people who are rich, politically connected, socially in the elite, a lot of them are very religious and intensely religious. So this whole kind of class analysis, that it's your social conditions that are determining what your beliefs are about religion, that seems to be not the case. Instead, religion is serving individual psychological purposes. If you are, for example, a strong, self-confident person who thinks you can take on the world, then you don't need this idea of a father who's your protector and telling you what to do, and he's going to make everything all right for you. You don't need that. You psychologically can rely on yourself and go forth and face the challenges in the world. So it's a matter then of psychological strength or not that's going to predict a person's religiosity. It's the weaker people, not necessarily weak in their pocketbooks or weak in their social standards, but weak in their psychology, who feel that the world is threatening, that they don't have much confidence in their own abilities to figure things out and to get their act together and go forth and make something of their lives. They need some sort of crutch. They need to believe that God's got their back, or that God has answered all of their questions and they just have to follow the formula. And if they follow the formula, then their life is going to be okay. But all of that then is an expression of a psychological weakness, and that psychological weakness is independent of one's economic class or one's social class in society. So again, religion is performing a practical function, but it's performing a practical function for a certain psychological type, completely independently of its truth. Freud, in The Next Generation, offers a very kind of a similar religion as a weakness analysis. He argues that religion is an illusion, so it's not true. It's just a bunch of stuff that it's made up. But he immediately blows past this question of proving that it's an illusion and going into all of the arguments for and against. That's not the interesting question for Freud. Instead, the question is, why is this illusion so psychologically compelling to so many people, and he gives an analysis of it in now classically Freudian terms as we think of them. That we like a father figure when we are infants. Not God yet, but Father. Our Father provides for us. Our Father protects us. Our Father provides guidance, and Father is sometimes stern and sometimes loving, but giving us our moral compass and pointing us in the right direction. And so some people grow up and learn to do all of those things for themselves, and so they can move out of their daddy's home or their mommy's home, and they don't need mommy and daddy anymore. But some people grow up weak. They never develop the psychological resources to be truly independent as adults. And then to the extent that they are forced out into the world, they have to leave their mommy's home, they have to leave their daddy's home, they don't feel up to the task. So they substitute God, or they substitute the gods for their father figure. And so God becomes a kind of father figure, God the protector, God the provider, and so on. Now, for Freud, this then is the psychological function of religion. God is a kind of father figure, and it is performing a real function for some people and helping them get through on a day-to-day basis. But what differs Freud from Nietzsche is that while Nietzsche wants to be scornful, so to speak, of people who would drop this religious crutch and kind of laugh at them or be sarcastic with them with respect to this pathetic set of beliefs that they need, Freud is not so sarcastic about the need of many people for some sort of a crutch in society. And he in fact goes on to argue that for the vast majority of people, they're never going to develop the psychological independence intellectually, emotionally, to be able to face the world as it really is. And so they do need some sort of insulating barrier, some sort of psychological crutch to help them put together meaningful lives. And so Freud wants to argue that other intellectuals should follow him in endorsing religion. You, as an intellectual, might be smart enough or educated enough or scientific enough or independent enough not to need religion, but you should realize that you are in a small elite of the population, and what's good for you functionally is not necessarily what's going to be good for the vast majority of the populace. So if we're not going to have kind of mass psychosis and mass neurosis out there in society more broadly, we should have some sort of religion out there, and intellectuals who are atheists should nonetheless, for social reasons, endorse religion as a pragmatic tool of social harmony. Is a bit strong here, but at least social peace, social possibility in progress. So what we then have is this interesting question. If we set aside the question of whether religion is true or not, there still is the question of what religion's source of staying power is. And of course, there are lots of different religions that emphasize lots of different things, and so are pushing different psychological buttons, pushing different social buttons. So we need to understand each religion in terms of its constellation of values that it is providing to individuals. And then if we are interested in particular individuals, individuals who are our friends or who are discussion partners or debate partners, getting to know those individuals as individuals in order to be able to customize our discussion to see what psychological and or social values religion is providing for them. This is an interesting set of issues, because if in fact there are no gods, then it's not the gods or God who's actually making and sustaining the universe. It's not the gods that are guaranteeing our cognition. It's not the gods that are making us behave in certain ways. It must be, if there are no gods, that the universe is in fact going of its own accord, and that some of us human beings are using religion for psychological or other utilitarian purposes. So what exactly is belief in religion doing for people? Now, in closing, I want to just do one recommendation. Of course, there's a lot of recommendations coming out of this. I do recommend that you look for yourself at the best philosophers' arguments for and against religions being true. So do have a look at Hume and Kant and Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard. They are giant names in the literature for a reason, and make up your own mind about whether you agree with them that the arguments for the existence of God or the gods don't work. Also do follow up, have a look at Tocqueville and his Democracy of America, look at Marx's analysis of religion, look at Nietzsche, look at Freud, and their various pragmatic or functional interpretations of religion. And of course, make up your own minds about which of those pragmatic or functionalist understandings of religion seem most valuable to you. But I want to add just one more contemporary source. Recently, David Kelly, a philosopher, published a short article along with a chart. The article is called The Role of Religion Today. You can just Google The Role of Religion Today. David Kelly, Kelley. That should pop up at Google or in your search engine, whichever one you are using. And in that article, though, there's a very handy chart in which Kelly goes through and identifies a number of needs that religion seems to be providing and does provide, independently or not of the question of whether religion is true or not. Understanding man's place in the universe, understanding the origin of the universe, where we came from, putting us in a position to control nature, trying to understand life and death, providing an answer to what the meaning of life is, giving us our moral ideals and particular moral rules, setting the standards for a just society, marking various rites of passage in life, birth, marriage, death, as a vehicle for self-improvement, providing an intellectual framework for education, providing guidance for the conduct of marriage, how you're supposed to raise children. Religion also provides a support network and all sorts of social connections. And then for many people, it's a matter of those interested in spiritual practices. And of course, religions often have aesthetic elements that are more or less prominent as well. So what's interesting about this list that Kelly provides is that it is the first one that I've seen in very nice compass that goes through all of these practical needs that religion attempts to satisfy. And then Kelly does go on to provide his view about whether religion's role is significant, minimal, or not at all with respect to these various things.
You are listening to Open College with Dr. Stephen Hicks. Follow Open College on X, Facebook, and on Substack at opencollegepodcast.substack.com. You can also follow Dr. Stephen Hicks on X at SRC Hicks and Open College Pod. Please leave a review in your podcast player and like, share, and subscribe to Open College.